Greetings all, and welcome to Sprues. In today's video, we're going to be having a look at the 1/72nd scale Hasegawa Kyushu J7W1 18-shy interceptor, known as the Shinden, or Magnificent Lightning. Of course, this is a prototype that appeared just at the end of World War II from Japan, and although it never saw combat during the war, it did later save Japan from the tyranny of Godzilla. So, without further ado, let's have a close look at this rather unusual looking aircraft. So, as usual, we'll start out by having a look at the box, followed by the instructions to see how this assembles, and then we'll have a close look at the plastic parts and the decals. So this appears to be the original 1996 release according to Scalemates, given the lack of any white trim on the box, which means this is one of the original kits from around about 30 years ago. The box art itself has a really nice picture of a Shinden flying through some pink clouds, which looks really lovely. And then we've got the logo of Hasegawa and the titles of Kyushu J7W1 18-shy interceptor fighter Shinden. On the bottom of the box here we have some various languages saying that this contains parts for one model kit, paint and glue are not included, and it has English instructions. We've then got repeats of the box art on the sides here, along with a kit of AP36 as well as 51336, so there seems to be quite a few different numbers and ways of identifying this one. And on the top here we have a nice picture of a finished model to give you some idea of what's inside and a bit of inspiration, along with barcodes, the scale, and a few other little details. Nothing on the bottom of the box, which is pretty typical for Hasegawa, and we appear to have some older labeling here in the corner, and various little stickers that have been added over this kit's life. Opening up, we have a single plastic bag here, which contains all of our sprues and our decals. And then at the very bottom here, we have our instructions. The instructions come with a very lovely picture of a finished model on the front, along with a history of the aircraft in various languages, which mention the first 3 test flights that it had before the end of the war, which totaled to around about 45 minutes of flying time, and at no point did it ever actually have its armament. It neglects to mention, of course, the fact that this aircraft was later used to take out Godzilla. However, the information about that battle might not have been released at the time this kit came out. Opening up, the instructions are a large fold-out format, which I'm not a huge fan of because it does take up a lot of space. You can kind of fold the instructions over, but some of them are slightly obscured, so it's not ideal. But in this corner here, we have all of our sprue maps, which is really handy to have, along with a little ticket here for Japanese use only, which I suspect is for spares and after-sale support. We've then got our colour guide here with a number assigned to each colour, and then I believe a Mr. Hobby colour code, and then just a name for each of the colours. I believe it's using pretty standard Japanese late war colours, so it should be reasonably easy to do a bit of online research if this is not going to be useful for you. The assembly then begins here with the cockpit, and it appears we've got a fair few little parts to add. We've got a tub here which makes up most of the cockpit, followed by the instrument panel which has a decal. Then we've got a joystick, a bit of framework, a few oxygen cylinders by the looks of things, and a bulkhead, plus of course the seat. Now I'm not sure if the prototype aircraft had an ejection seat like the one that took out Godzilla did, however it would make sense to me that it did, seeing as it was being experimented with in other aircraft at the time, and if you were the pilot you'd probably want to be launched away from the big spinny blade of death that was behind you when you were bailing out. For step 2, we have a note to add ballast, although it's pretty small. There is another little one here saying all that you need is 1 gram. I suspect you might want to put a little bit more in just in case, but yeah, there's a little note there, so make sure you do that. We've then got a piece here which appears to be the nose wheel compartment that gets glued to the front of the fuselage halves. Then you've got the cockpit assembly which you install before then joining the other fuselage. The wings are then assembled here, and they have a single piece for the lower half and then 2 for the upper half. Step 4 then consists of adding the armament to the front panel here, which also contains the canards. We've then got various intakes that were added in an attempt to cool the 18-cylinder radial engine in the back there, followed by adding the wings and the tails. Of course, for the vertical tails, you'll want to be careful to put the tail wheel at the bottom of them, given that that's where they should be. I find it very humorous that it's been added to this aircraft. I believe one of the prototype flights resulted in the pilot rotating too quickly, and it actually struck the propeller. So I don't know whether they've added that to protect the vertical stabilizer as well as the propeller, but it makes sense. For step 5, we then add the nose wheel, which is a single very large piece there, followed by the landing gear bay doors and some small doors here for the main wheels. We've actually got a separate little guide here for painting the nose wheel, and then another one here for when you're painting the main wheels. And assembly of the main wheels is a tiny bit more complex. The wheels are separate from the struts, and you also have to add this extra little hingey bit to the bottom. But once that's done, you can then attach it to the underside of the wings, along with some more landing gear bay doors and the larger doors that sit on the outside of the wheels there. For step 7, we then have the rear of the engine there with some cylinder head and gearbox details by the looks of things, followed by the massive 6-blade propeller and the spinner cover. And finally, we then have our canopy, which unfortunately is a single piece, but given the look of this, it's pretty typical for older Hasegawa style cockpits, so there probably isn't an awful lot of detail anyways. Shame no pilot figure is included, but that seems to be pretty typical of more modern-ish kits that are sort of post the 80s. But I'm sure you could probably find some spare ones or 3D print them if you really wanted. On the other side of these instructions, we've also got some guides here on how to go about doing certain steps. So if you're a beginner and this is your first kit, a really great little thing to have a read of. And then we have our marking guide for the single prototype aircraft that actually flew before the war ended. And this is Shinden #1 from August of 1945. I do find it a little bit annoying they haven't included the paint guide on this page, because then you have to basically flip back here and find the first number to identify the colour. But luckily it's a pretty simple scheme with just the two-tone camouflage, a little bit of yellow, which I think is represented as a decal anyways, so it shouldn't be too hard to paint. Moving on to the sprues here, which as mentioned are all in this single bag here, including the clear part, which unfortunately has come off the sprue, so there's a good chance it's gotten scratched up in the time that this kit's been sitting around. So we'll open it up and have a close look at everything. So starting off with sprue A here, which also has a bit of sprue F attached to it. We have our two upper wings by the looks of things, and as you can see we've got some very nice crisp recessed details, not too exaggerated, they look quite nice and subtle, with a few nice details such as these little access hatches on the various tanks and things inside of the wings, some nice control surfaces there with some linkages done with raised detailing, and a few little nice looking bumps there which look pretty good. The pitot tube comes molded to the right top wing half there, which is going to be a little bit of a pain because when you're painting it there's a good chance that can get knocked and damaged, but it still looks pretty good. There does appear to be some very subtle light flashing on the edges of these parts, but nothing too serious. We've then got our canards here with some of the 30mm cannons muzzles molded into this upper part here, and the other two are holes, so they might be a little bit more deeper or recessed. Interestingly, the cannon barrels appear to be out of alignment, which I'd imagine is so that they could fit. There's some very small linkage details on the very ends of the canards there, which look pretty impressive. Otherwise, it's all some very nicely done recessed detailing, although there does appear to be some sort of imperfection in the plastic on this part of the fuselage there, with some sort of scratches there, if you can sort of see in the light. It feels like they might be part of the surface, so might need a bit of sanding on that part, but otherwise not terrible. Part 2 has come loose of the sprue here, but it would be our nose wheel bay here, which actually has some raised ribbing details on the inside there. Nothing too much on the sides, it's more on the very roof there, and there are a couple of ejector pin marks that might be a little bit tricky to remove, and no real detail on the top there, but that doesn't really matter too much. Our nose wheel here looks pretty decent. Again, there seems to be some sort of imperfection in the plastic on the wheel hub there, and there isn't too much detail really. It's sort of just some flat circles, but I think they might have had wheel hubs on them anyways. Although the nose wheel here itself has a fair bit more detail. We appear to have some sort of towing mount or lock, and then some hinges there, which all look really amazing. And just to the left of the nose wheel, we have our cockpit tub here, which actually has some raised details, which is a bit of an improvement from some of the other Hasegawa kits I've seen. There's sort of some basic bumps to represent where the throttle controls and the trim are, I believe. And we've also got very basic rudder pedals, which are just sort of square pegs on the floor, and some various guide pins to help line parts up, including these for the framework, and this one here for the joystick and the seat. Sprue F on the outside here contains our engine cowling, or the rear, I suppose, of the engine, with as well some intakes here, which look pretty nice. I'm not 100% sure if this is supposed to be the engine details, or perhaps if they had some sort of structural mounting points at the rear, seeing as usually on an aircraft this would be where the air would flow in to cool the cylinders on a radial. However, obviously, because it's backwards, it would have to come from the front here. So, not sure. It could also be a cooling fan. And we do have a very vague bump here, which would be for the gearbox to mount the propeller to. Moving on to sprue B here, which has our fuselage halves. They once again have some really nice recessed details, and I love that it's pretty crisp and also subtle. There again are some small imperfections in the plastic, with a few little scratch marks here and there, but otherwise nothing too major. A tiny bit of flash here and there, but it can get sanded off quite easily. And yeah, the details look really quite nice. We've got these various panels, and we've got little access hatches and circular access doors. They all look pretty good. We've got some of the intake system here molded to the fuselage there, which looks pretty cleanly done. And we've got these holes here, which I believe are to mount more of the intakes. The gun sight is molded to the left fuselage half here, and on the inside though there is no cockpit detail. Although it appears we've got some of the wall sort of sanded or etched out, so there might be a piece that goes in there. Probably part of the cockpit tub that sort of fills in that gap there. There are a few little ejector pin marks, but they're all in very nice invisible spots, which is great. And the other fuselage is pretty similar in details, the only difference being it doesn't have the gun sight molded to it, but otherwise quite nice looking. We've got some more intakes here, which I think kind of mount at the front of the fuselage there. There's a few ejector pins that are molded to them, which will have to be cut and sanded off, and they do look like they're going to be a little bit awkward to remove from the sprue without damaging them, but as long as you're careful, that should be okay. We've then got our propeller blades here, which seem pretty solid and quite nicely done. There is a bit of flash that's going to need to be lightly sanded off the edges of each blade, but otherwise it looks pretty good. We've got our tail piece here with the tail wheels, or the bump wheels, kind of molded into them, along with some very nice and fine control joint hinges or possibly counterbalances. And finally for this sprue, we've got our main landing gear struts there, which are nicely done with a few little details here, and they all look pretty cleanly molded as well, which is good. Sprue D here contains our various smaller parts, such as the main landing gear bay doors, what looks like some antennas, and the nose wheel doors. It looks like part of the nose wheel door is actually broken off, so I'll have to have a look in the plastic bag to see if I can find it, but that's a bit of a shame. We've got more little landing gear bay doors by the looks of things. The Hasegawa logo, which is quite cool, embedded into the sprue. And then we've got our various cockpit parts, including the rear bulkhead here with a ejector pin mark sort of in the middle, but hopefully that will be covered by the seat, and a little oxygen tank molded into it. We've got our control column there, which looks quite nicely done. We've got our main instrument panel here, which doesn't have any recessed detailing, which is pretty typical of Hasegawa, so all of your detail is going to come from a decal. We've got more main landing gear bay door flaps there, I think for the inner part. We've got this sort of structural piece. I'm not sure if it's some sort of railing mount for if there was an ejection seat in this kit, or if it's structural part of the aircraft, but it looks pretty nicely done. Just going to have to be careful when removing it from the sprue there. We've got our seat here, which is pretty basic. They have done some raised edges here and some recesses for where this kind of cushion is, but there's also an ejector pin mark in the middle of the seat that's going to need to be sanded down if you're not adding a pilot. And then finally in this corner here we have the spinner, which again has some of those strange sort of plastic scratches on the surface there, but otherwise looks pretty solidly done. And for sprue E here, which we have two of, one of them's actually come off of this sprue and the other one is attached, but they appear to be identical. And they contain our main landing gear wheel there, which looks pretty good. Interestingly, there's more detail on the inner part here than the outer, which has just a cover for the wheel hub. Unfortunately, there's a few ejector pin marks on these parts, which are going to have to get sanded or filled over a little bit. And some little parts here for the main landing gear strut. And finally, the other 30mm cannon barrel by the looks of things. Finally, we have our last two sprues, which is sprue C, the underside of the wings there, which looks really quite nicely done. Again, we've got really nice recessed details with the various access parts. Some little raised aerodynamic devices here, which I think are actually where the vertical stabilizer links up. And of course we've got the wheel wells, which actually have some raised ribbing inside of them, which doesn't look too bad at all. And as for sprue G, which is our canopy, unfortunately it's come off the sprue and is, by the looks of things, been rolling around for quite some time. and unfortunately there are a fair few scratches on it, which is a shame. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Hasegawa canopies, as they tend to have only faint raised lines for separating the canopy framework from the glass, which maybe is a bit more accurate for scale, but it makes it a lot harder, I find, to paint them by hand, as you don't have a clear raised framework to follow, and it's very hard to clean up. Otherwise though, clarity's okay, and I'm sure if they were new and they hadn't been scratched, they'd be a lot better, but unfortunately, they're not the best. The last thing we have to look at in this kit are the decals, and curiously, they seem to have some sort of glossy film on them that has been partially removed, and you can see that on all of the red roundels there. There's little patches of glossiness on them, and then other areas that are not, so I'm not sure if that's a production fault or if that's a part of them aging. All of the decals have appeared to have yellowed, especially these clear bits here with these various walkway markings. There also appears to be either some dirt or mould or something on this part of the decals there, which kind of partially covers the instrument panel and these yellow markings. And then we've got the tips of the propeller blades there and some more common sort of stencils there. So fortunately, these aren't too complicated decals, so I'm probably going to either try and use them and see how they go, or more likely I will try and print my own or see if I've got enough spares to get by. Generally, I find Hasegawa kit decals to be pretty good, but they seem to yellow really easily. This one says 1995.7, so I'm not sure if that's actually a production date on the decals, which is kind of cool. But yeah, unfortunately, it looks like these decals might be beyond using, but see how we go when I'm actually building it. So that wraps up my look at the 1/72nd scale Shinden from Hasegawa, an aircraft which may have not achieved its original purpose of intercepting B-29s, but one that definitely earned the nickname Magnificent Lightning after taking out Godzilla. And this is quite a nice little kit that pays homage to this aircraft with some really lovely recessed detailing, and although it's a little bit simpler than much more modern kits, and there are a few issues I found with quality, although that could just be because this is a second-hand kit and the parts have been knocking around scratching each other for a while, I'd say it's a pretty decent kit. I am contemplating 3D printing a few parts to give it some extra detail, given that it's probably going to be a one-off aircraft that I do. And I'm also not sure if I'm going to go with the prototype aircraft, the one that took out Godzilla, or maybe even a what if this aircraft entered service in World War II sort of scheme. It's probably going to be quite a while before I get around to actually doing this one, however, as I have quite a lot of other kits I'm working on. But if you want to see this one done sooner rather than later, feel free to shout at me in the comments below. And also feel free to share your own opinions of this kit if you've built it or having just seen it now. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And feel free to leave your thoughts on this kit or whether you want to see me build it in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them, and the various animations and other projects I have planned. Happy April Fools, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.